So just to summarize, I guess on the leasing rule and to the background there, in the 90s, Secretary of Interior Bruce Babbitt placed biodiversity conservation at the center of Department of Interior's mission for public lands management. And so just before that is when President Clinton signed the Biodiversity Convention in 1993, which was developed at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. But the Senate never acted to advise or ratify the convention. So subsequently, the environmental community has failed to adequately demonstrate that such commitments to biodiversity conservation is anything more than mere rhetoric. And that's evidenced by the fact that Congress over the last 25 plus years has not enacted any laws which authorize, let alone require, far-reaching biodiversity conservation measures. So in other words, under the Biodiversity Convention, they got some things done and they pushed pretty hard, but they never really had the success they wanted. Because ultimately the Senate never did ratify that convention. So now, coming into the modern era of land use planning, what's happening is the environmental community is now pushing for more executive bureaucracy activity to implement biodiversity conservation initiatives. So with the inception of the Paris Accord, what the environmental community is now doing is creating a natural asset class to connect to biodiversity conservation. Ooh. That's the economic elements that are coming into play in this process. You may be familiar, some of your listeners familiar with what's happening in the international finance realm and the White House issuing documents to create a natural asset class, and that ties into your carbon markets and other things. But this also links to this conservation leasing rule. And so this current rule seeks to establish administrative mechanisms in order to facilitate artificial avenues for private investments into natural resource lands without the extractive material products to attach a value to. So that will create an illusion of private market value for the application of non-use of lands, which then will be sold and marketed into the international finance realm as a natural asset class to be purchased by large regulated corporations as a carbon credit to offset their emissions. By the way, this will all be done with no calculable benefits to local governments and citizens. So interestingly enough, basically you'll have, as a result of this rule, in my opinion, if it gets promulgated, the connection to these asset classes that allow corporations, basically in religious terminology, to pay their indulgences.
Sure.
You know, I'm gonna use oil and gas for my purposes, and I'll buy these credits developed by these third-party entities applying conservation leases on public lands and creating a economic framework. So this is a very, very dangerous trajectory on the leasing and permitting of our public lands, especially when, and the reason I connected, just to verify this, to the natural asset class aspect is because the White House published a document early this year called the White House Natural Capital Accounting Strategy, which places conservation as an economic necessity. So these processes seek to arbitrarily place a value on non-use of public lands and then inventory them under the 30 by 30 conservation objectives. The White House document I just mentioned in Section E, page 12, specifically states, quote, the planned conservation stewardship atlas, and that's the inventorying tool they're creating, will function as a tool for tracking a range of conservation benefits provided by U.S. lands and waters, particularly for biodiversity, climate, and equity benefits. So the conservation leasing rule creates a regulatory framework for Department of Interior to transition lands from use to non-use. And the Conservation Stewardship Atlas is the inventorying mechanism that they track that transition. And then they pass that inventory over to the Environmental Protection Agency and the State Department, who then compiles those inventories on Article 4, 7, and 14 of the Paris Accord and delivers that as a contribution to our nationally determined contributions biannually as a global stock take for carbon emission reductions. Because under those nationally determined contributions, land use is included for those decarbonization objectives. So these conservation leases, and by the way, everything I just said, those dots I connected, you're not going to see those things on the Federal Register relating to this rule. But the same departments that issued the nationally determined contribution that says we're going to follow the guidance for the IPCC and the CMA annexes that were developed in these international conventions are the same departments that are issuing these rules and regulatory rewrites to transition our lands into conservation status. And then you have the Conservation Stewardship Atlas, which was developed pursuant to the 30 by 30 initiative, to inventory that transition, track it, and report it to the international community as a nationally determined contribution. Some people are connecting those dots, but I would submit to you and your audience that if we don't start recognizing how the international climate agenda is driving domestic policy, we're not going to be able to deal with what's actually happening through these federal departments.
Unbelievable.
And Congress needs to get involved, in my opinion, because they have jurisdiction in Article 1 over international contexts such as what I'm bringing forward.